Artemis II was more dangerous than Apollo 11. That sounds like an absurd thing to say. Apollo 11 flew in 1969 with a guidance computer that had about 72 kilobytes of read-only memory and 4 kilobytes of RAM. Less storage than a single photograph on your phone. It landed 2 men on the surface of an alien world with no backup plan if the engine didn't relight, and came home on a heat shield that had never been tested at lunar reentry speeds with humans aboard. And yet, the mission that splashed down on April 10, 2026, with all the technology of the 21st century behind it, carried risks that would have made the Apollo engineers lose sleep. Let me explain why. We tend to think of danger in space as something that belonged to the past. The early days, the cowboy era, when astronauts climbed into tin cans strapped to modified ballistic missiles and hoped for the best. Apollo 11 was the peak of that era. 3 men launched on a Saturn V, a rocket with the explosive energy equivalent of a small nuclear weapon, and flew 250,000 miles to a place no human had ever touched. Neil Armstrong had to manually fly the lunar module past a boulder field to find a safe landing spot with roughly 25 seconds of fuel remaining. If the ascent engine on the lunar module had failed to ignite after their moonwalk, Armstrong and Aldrin would have died on the surface. President Nixon had a eulogy ready. William Safire wrote it. It sat in a folder in the White House waiting. That's the image we carry, Apollo as the ultimate gamble. And in many ways, it was. The lunar module's walls were so thin you could punch through them with a screwdriver. Armstrong's heart rate hit 150 beats per minute during the final descent as program alarms blared in the cockpit, and Mission Control had seconds to decide whether to abort. The entire landing sequence relied on a single ascent engine that had never been fired on the moon before. And if it had failed after the moonwalk, there was no Plan B, no rescue mission, no second lander waiting in orbit, just a slow death on the surface and a speech from the president. Those risks were real, extraordinary, and accepted by 3 men who understood exactly what they were signing up for. So when NASA launched Artemis II on April 1, 2026, sending Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day flight around the moon, the public assumption was simple. This is the safe version. 57 years of progress. Better materials, better computers, better everything. We've done this before. It should be routine. It wasn't routine. It was in certain critical ways a more precarious mission than what Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin flew 57 years earlier. And the reason comes down to a single component that most people never think about until it fails: the heat shield. When a spacecraft returns from the moon, it hits Earth's atmosphere at roughly 25,000 mph. That is over 30 times the speed of sound. The air in front of the capsule compresses so violently that it reaches temperatures above 18,000 degrees F, about twice the temperature of the surface of the Sun. The capsule's heat shield itself reaches around 5,000 degrees F. The air turns into electrically charged plasma that wraps around the vehicle and cuts off all radio communication. For 6 minutes during Artemis II's re-entry, nobody on Earth could talk to the crew. Nobody could help them. They were falling through fire alone. Every crewed lunar mission in history has faced this moment. Apollo faced it too. The difference is that Apollo's heat shield worked exactly as expected. Artemis II's heat shield had a known defect before the crew ever boarded. Rewind to December 2022. Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight, splashed down in the Pacific after a successful trip around the moon. Engineers were thrilled. The SLS rocket had worked. Orion had performed beautifully. Then they pulled the capsule out of the water and looked at the bottom. The heat shield was covered in pockmarks. Chunks of the ablative material, a substance called avcoat, had cracked and broken away in locations that the computer models never predicted. NASA's Office of Inspector General documented more than 100 locations where the material had worn away differently than expected. 3 of 4 separation bolts embedded in the shield had melted through their thermal barriers. The parachute cover, which might have shown evidence of debris impact from the flying shield fragments, was never recovered. It sank to the bottom of the Pacific. The damage didn't cause a catastrophic failure. Internal temperatures inside the crew cabin stayed in the mid-70s Fahrenheit throughout re-entry. If astronauts had been aboard Artemis I, they would have survived. NASA was quick to point that out. There was margin remaining, virgin avcoat still intact beneath the damaged layers. That distinction matters, but it also misses the larger point. The models were wrong. The ground testing didn't predict what happened, and the heat shield for Artemis II was already built, essentially identical to the one that had just come back looking like the surface of the moon itself. NASA spent nearly 2 years investigating. In December 2024, they announced a root cause. The issue centered on a property of the avcoat material called permeability, its ability to let gases escape through its structure. During re-entry, avcoat is supposed to slowly burn away in a controlled process called ablation. As it heats up, the material undergoes pyrolysis, a kind of combustion without oxygen, and generates gas. That gas needs to vent outward through the charred outer layer. If it can't vent, pressure builds inside the shield and pieces blow off. On Artemis I, NASA used a technique called skip re-entry. The capsule dipped into the atmosphere, bounced back out like a stone skipping across a lake, and then plunged back in for final descent. Apollo used the same technique. Apollo's heat shields handled it fine. The problem was that the avcoat on Orion is not the same as the avcoat on Apollo. It was reformulated. The manufacturing process changed entirely. Apollo's heat shield was a single honeycomb matrix of hundreds of thousands of individually filled hexagonal cells. Orion's shield uses about 200 prefabricated avcoat blocks. Think of it like the difference between a mosaic made of tiny hand-placed tiles and one made of large prefab panels. The new formulation turned out to be less permeable, and during that skip phase, when the capsule climbed back out of the atmosphere and external heating dropped, the outer char layer sealed up. The interior was still blazing hot, still producing gas, but the gas had nowhere to go. Pressure built, cracks formed, and when the capsule dove back in for its second pass, the weakened shield started shedding material. Apollo engineers actually knew about the permeability issue. They designed around it. The original honeycomb structure, with its hundreds of thousands of tiny cells, naturally created pathways for gas to escape. Each cell was individually filled, and the boundaries between cells acted as microchannels. The system breathed. When those engineers retired, when the contracts ended, when the manufacturing was handed to new companies and reformulated for a larger capsule, that understanding didn't transfer. The avcoat formula was licensed by its original developer, Textron Systems, to Lockheed Martin, who manufactured the Artemis shields under contract to NASA. And in an ironic twist that would almost be funny if lives weren't at stake, the Artemis II heat shield was actually made even less permeable than the Artemis I shield, not more. The reason was to make it easier to perform ultrasonic testing during quality inspections. They made the material denser so they could check it more thoroughly, which inadvertently made the permeability problem worse. The very act of trying to ensure quality may have increased the risk. The permeability lessons from Apollo were never internalized by the next generation. Somewhere in the 5 decades between Apollo 17 and Artemis I, the knowledge that kept astronauts alive during re-entry was quietly forgotten. And this is the detail that makes the whole comparison click. Apollo 11 was built by people who were inventing everything for the first time, which meant they questioned everything because there was no precedent to lean on. Artemis was built by people who thought they were inheriting a solved problem, which meant they questioned less. The confidence was inherited, the understanding was not. NASA had two options: redesign the heat shield entirely, which would delay the mission by at least 2 more years, or fly the existing shield and change the re-entry trajectory to avoid the conditions that caused the damage. They chose the second option. The modified plan shortened the skip. Instead of a long bounce back out of the atmosphere, Artemis II would make a shallower initial dip, followed by a much shorter climb before final descent. The idea was to keep the outer char layer hot enough throughout the entire re-entry to maintain permeability. If the char stays permeable, the gas vents, the pressure doesn't build, and the shield holds. But keeping it hotter also meant higher sustained heating on the crew and the capsule, and it shrank the distance Orion could fly to avoid bad weather at the splashdown site. They traded one safety margin for another. Engineers tested this approach in ArcJet facilities at NASA's Ames Research Center and verified that it worked on small samples of avcoat. An independent review panel agreed with their analysis. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, after reviewing the data in January 2026, gave the go-ahead. Not everyone was convinced. Charles Camarda, a former NASA astronaut and heat shield expert who had been on the first shuttle crew to fly after the Columbia disaster, publicly opposed the decision. He attended meetings at NASA headquarters in January 2026 to review the data and walked away unconvinced. His concern wasn't that Artemis II would necessarily fail. He thought it would probably come home safely. What terrified him was the reasoning process. The same computer models that failed to predict the Artemis I damage were being used to certify the Artemis II fix. NASA had worked backward from flight data to reproduce the cracking in a lab, but they had no validated way to predict how the full-size shield would behave under conditions it had never actually experienced. Commander Wiseman saw it differently. He sat through the engineering reviews, examined the data with the experts, and came away confident. In his words, if anyone who was about to board the rocket had sat in those meetings, listened to the engineers, and gone through the data, they would have had the same comfort he did. That's worth something. But it's also worth noting that astronauts are by nature, and by selection, people who run toward risk. That's what they do. The question is whether the institution behind them is managing that risk or rationalizing it. Camarda saw a pattern he recognized. Columbia is the parallel that should keep you up at night. In 2003, a piece of foam insulation broke off the external tank during launch and struck the left wing of the shuttle, punching a hole in the thermal protection tiles. Engineers at NASA noticed the foam strike on camera during the mission. Some raised concerns. They asked for satellite imagery of the wing to assess the damage. Management declined the request. The reasoning was familiar. Foam strikes had happened before, and the shuttle had always been fine. Columbia broke apart during re-entry on February 1, 2003. 7 crew members died. Camarda watched the Artemis II heat shield debate unfold and saw echoes of that logic. We flew it before and it was fine. The margins were adequate. The risk is acceptable. He warned that a successful Artemis II flight would actually be the most dangerous possible outcome in one sense. It would validate a decision-making process that he believed was fundamentally flawed. Success would teach NASA that it could fly known defects, and that lesson applied to the wrong mission in the future could be catastrophic. Now compare this to Apollo 11 directly. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins flew with a heat shield that had been designed specifically for the re-entry conditions it would face. The avcoat formulation was proven, the manufacturing was understood. The permeability characteristics were accounted for when Apollo 11 hit the atmosphere at roughly $25,000 Mbeshki on July 24, 1969. The shield performed as predicted. No surprises, no chunks missing. The danger of Apollo 11 was in the unknowns, The things nobody could test in advance, like whether the lunar module would actually work on the surface. The heat shield was one of the things they felt confident about. Artemis II flipped that equation. The mission didn't land on the moon. It didn't dock with anything. It didn't deploy a lunar module. Most of the complex rendezvous and landing operations that made Apollo 11 so harrowing were absent from the flight plan. Fly out, loop around, come home. A free return trajectory, meaning that even if the engine never fired again after the translunar injection burn, the moon's gravity would sling the capsule back toward Earth. Apollo 13 flew a similar profile in April 1970, and that trajectory saved their lives. The danger of Artemis II was concentrated in those final 34 minutes on April 10th. The time between the crew module separating from the service module and splashdown in the Pacific. 13 minutes of active re-entry where everything had to go right. The angle had to be precise. Too steep, and the G-forces would be lethal. The heating, catastrophic. Too shallow, and the capsule would skip off the atmosphere into space with no way to return. The parachutes, all 11 of them deployed in sequence, had to open. The capsule had to survive the transition from roughly 25,000 mph to 19 mph, a deceleration that subjected the crew to nearly 4 Gs. If you discovered that your car's brakes had a design flaw that caused them to overheat during prolonged downhill driving, you wouldn't just say, "We'll avoid hills." You'd fix the brakes. NASA essentially said, "We'll avoid hills." And the hill they were avoiding was the specific thermal profile of a full-skip re-entry, which happened to be the trajectory designed to give them the most flexibility for weather avoidance at the splashdown site. On April 10th, the physics cooperated at 7:33 p.m. Eastern. The crew module separated from the European-built service module, exposing the heat shield to open space for the first time. 4 minutes later, Orion fired a brief 18-second raise burn to set the proper entry angle. At 7:53 p.m., still 19956 mi from the splashdown site, the capsule hit the top of the atmosphere at 400,000 ft, traveling 24,661 mi, just 130 mi short of the speed record set by Apollo 10's crew in May 1969. The re-entry was fully automated. The crew rode the Fireball on autopilot, their lives in the hands of the guidance system and the heat shield beneath them. The plasma wrapped around the capsule. Communications went dark. In mission control, the families of the astronauts sat in a viewing room waiting. Lead Flight Director Jeff Radigan admitted to feeling what he called an irrational fear that is simply human nature. 6 minutes later, the capsule emerged from blackout. 2 drogue parachutes deployed first, slowing Orion to about 300 mph. Then 3 pilot chutes. Then 3 enormous mains big enough to cover a football field, billowing open in sequence and bringing the capsule down to about 19 mph. At 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time, Orion hit the water off the coast of San Diego. Mission Control called it a perfect bullseye. Commander Wiseman radioed that all 4 crew members were doing well. Within 2 hours, recovery teams had them out of the capsule onto a raft and lifted by helicopter to the USS John P. Murtha. The heat shield held. But how well? That question won't be fully answered until engineers pull the capsule apart in the coming weeks. Every crack, every divot, every region of unexpected ablation will be cataloged, measured, and compared to the predictions. If the shield performed as the modified trajectory was designed to ensure, it validates the operational fix. If it shows damage patterns that look anything like Artemis I, it will raise serious questions about every assumption that went into the decision to fly. There's another layer to this that doesn't get discussed enough. The Orion capsule is bigger than Apollo's command module. Apollo measured about 12 ft/10 in across the base. Orion is 16 1 to 2 ft. That larger heat shield has more surface area, more avcoat blocks, more joints between those blocks, and more opportunities for uneven ablation. Scaling up a thermal protection system is not a linear problem. The physics of gas permeability, thermal expansion, and pressure distribution all change with size. Apollo 11's crew faced the terror of landing on the Moon with 25 seconds of fuel. Artemis II's crew faced the terror of re-entering Earth's atmosphere in a capsule whose thermal protection system had already failed once and been patched with a trajectory change rather than a hardware fix. Apollo 11's danger was the kind you sign up for when you volunteer to do something no one has done before. Artemis II's danger was the kind that comes from institutional compromise, from the gap between what engineers know and what managers decide. The mission succeeded. Victor Glover described watching the sun disappear behind the Moon in a total solar eclipse from Orion's windows and called it one of the greatest gifts of the mission. Christina Cook peered back at Earth from 250,000 miles away. Jeremy Hansen became the first Canadian to leave low Earth orbit. Reid Wiseman commanded the farthest crewed flight from Earth in human history, reaching 252,756 miles from home on April 6th and beating Apollo 13's record by over 4,000 miles. Those are the stories that will be told. The triumph, the images of Earth set behind the Moon, the crew naming craters after their spacecraft, and loved ones, the splashdown, and the cheers. The heat shield story will fade into technical footnotes. NASA has already announced that future Artemis missions will use a redesigned shield with improved avcoat permeability. The data from Artemis II's heat shield will directly determine the timeline for Artemis III, the mission that is supposed to actually land astronauts on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. If the shield performed well, the program moves forward. If it didn't, every downstream mission gets pushed back while engineers redesign. The Artemis II shield will become an artifact of a transition period, a growing pain between eras, but its performance, once the engineers finish their analysis, will shape the future of human spaceflight for the next decade. But the lesson is the one that Charles Camarda tried to sound the alarm about, the one that echoes through Challenger and Columbia and every other moment where institutional momentum outran engineering certainty. The most dangerous missions aren't always the ones with the most dramatic objectives. Sometimes the most dangerous mission is the one where everyone agrees it will probably be fine. Apollo 11 flew into the unknown. Artemis II flew into something arguably worse, the partially known. The space where you have enough data to convince yourself you understand the risk, but not enough to prove it. Apollo's astronauts carried the weight of complete uncertainty and the freedom that comes with it. Every engineer on that program knew they were guessing and that honesty made them careful. Artemis II's astronauts carried the weight of a specific identified unresolved problem, and the institutional assurance that it had been managed is a very different word than solved. 4 astronauts are home because the physics cooperated with the math, because the modified trajectory kept the char layer permeable, because the gas vented and the pressure didn't build, and the avcoat held together through 5,000 degree F and 3.9 Gs and 6 minutes of silence. Next time NASA will have a better shield. Next time the models might actually predict what the material does. Next time the institutional knowledge will be a little less fragile, but this time on this flight, Artemis II threaded a needle that Apollo never had to thread, and the fact that it worked doesn't mean it wasn't the more dangerous bet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.